Welcome, everybody. This is the third lecture in the International Marketing elective in the MSc in International Business at the University of Manchester. And what I'm going to do today is talk about segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So the first two lectures really focused on structural things behind international marketing. The more or less institutional, organizational components in the first lecture and the cultural components in the second lecture. So this is kind of the first of the real marketing, pure marketing types of discussions. So if you remember, we talked about a whole host of different things in the last two lectures, and also with respect to the last two cases. So the last two lectures focused on issues related to standardization, adaptation, structure of ownership, the competing demands of meeting local needs versus standardization and getting your economies of scale, economies of scope through production. And then the ownership structures. So if you look at this graph, right, this is sort of the basics of it. Almost kind of captures everything we talked about. And that is that these components here, the global integration, local responsiveness, the centralization decision, kind of being driven by this aspect of what it is that matters, kind of the economics of supply, the economics of demand. And then the structural aspects of this being driven by that transactional completeness. What do I need to own? What can I rent? What can I contract out? And to some degree, these last bits and pieces capture a lot of what you see is in things like internalization theory and transaction cost economics. And then we talked a bit about culture, and there really was quite a lot there, and we'll come back to this again and again and again. But sort of the underlying kind of what makes up culture, how it might be developed, if you thought about starting with a clean slate. But as I noted, there's a lot of skepticism as to sort of kind of is this really kind of a sequence of things, and how much of this is really kind of purely endogenous. But we also talked about a bit around the characterization, and I hope the thing that you got from this is really that the heterogeneity might be able to be aggregated up into certain types of things, but rarely, if ever, is it going to be purely national. So having these rather gross cultural characterizations that we sometimes see in international business doesn't necessarily always get you the most useful information or the most managerially operational from a meaningful sense. And as I'll come back to this as we go along, the way to think about it is to think about every individual as actually having many cultures that kind of embody what it is that they are. Now, the heart of marketing is really this structure, segmentation, targeting, positioning model. So it almost everything we're going to talk about for the rest of the course is kind of can be captured in a lot of this. So you can think about this in a very simple way, and that is that, how do I determine what parts of the market I serve? How do I actually decide how to break this market up? And this in some sense can be thought of in, again, very simply, and that is that, many years ago, probably in 1970s, there was a belief about the idea in marketing of what they called segments of one, where every individual is a unique segment. And in the basics of this was, well, if you start with segments of one and aggregate up, you can start getting a viewpoint as to what the trade-offs are that you make. So in the best of all possible worlds in which there are no transaction costs, you treat every individual as an individual, and you adapt, to the extent that you possibly can to each of those individual needs. But the reality of that is you can't do that, and therefore you can't make an infinite number of products. So what you do is you engage in some degree of clustering of those individuals in some way, shape, or form. And I'll come back later on to talk about this. But one of the questions, of course, is do you allow the individuals to naturally cluster on their own, or do you try to enforce the clustering based upon some sort of beliefs about what it is that makes individuals similar? But fundamentally, what you're doing is you're trying to identify the things on which you do the segmentation, and then being able to characterize that. So that's the identification and the development of that. Once you sort of say, okay, well, I've got a picture of the world, I know what that landscape looks like. You can sit there and sort of say, okay, well, who do I go after? Because ultimately the decision, particularly in the international context, as I've emphasized before, is what to say no to. In other words, what segments you do not attempt to satisfy. And and in this sense, it allows you to be able to be, kind of efficient, and targeted in some very specific type of way with respect to your advertising, your product design, and on that line. And so it's the question of sort of kind of, well, which one of these are the most appropriate? Now, it's sometimes called segment attractiveness. In other words, for each firm, different segments will have different attractiveness, where that attractiveness will be related to a number of characteristics, the most obvious of which is that it is, from a performance standpoint, the ones which earn you the most money. And then the positioning aspect of this, and that is, how do you identify these 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 groups, and this relates back to the profiles associated with the segments, and then saying, okay, well, how do I put together a package of things with respect to being able to sort of kind of link into them in the most effective way. And in this regard, you're really kind of capturing a very simple thing, and that is, I identify them, identify the market, I determine the lay of the landscape, I pick the components of that landscape that are most important to me, and I reinforce that. I reinforce that by positioning vis-a-vis my competitors. So that what I'm doing is I'm more or less engaging in a bit of a strategic game where I am solidifying my position, but also protecting my position against competitors. And essentially, this drives the design of the entire product portfolio. And this is where when you come back and you start to think about the complexity of this, is that not all products may be reinforcing. You may have purposeful cannibalization in your portfolio. In other words, it's better for you to have a portfolio where some of your products leak and steal demand from other of your products, rather than have that go to your competitors. So you may degrade, for example, the market position of some of your stronger products, simply because the alternative is to let your competitors degrade it. And some will be complementary in the sense that there's for example, potentially a progression up the value curve in the sense of what you're doing is you're moving people from sort of kind of low value added to high value added products that you provide, but also things like cross selling, or having a complementarity in terms of the nature of the development of the things that you do. So for example, if you look at a grocery store, many grocery stores will have own brands. So Tesco will have an own brand, Kroger will have an own brand. So you have a set of circumstances in which the retailer is selling its own product that's competing against the products of others that put their products on the shelf, right? So they'll have their own can of beans, and they'll have Heinz can of beans. And you might sort of say, well, does it make any sense? In the sense, doesn't Heinz get upset about that? And the answer is, Not really, because it may be that in the background, Heinz actually has a contract where it's creating the cans of beans that are being sold as the store brand. So you have this curious mixture, which is related to the portfolio of the products and services being provided in terms of the nature of sort of kind of what it is you're delivering. And the other aspect of this is while I presented it initially as a segmentation, targeting, and positioning, these things have a natural endogeneity to them in the sense that you can make an assumption and sort of say, well, the segmentation is there, and all you do is discover it. Well, that isn't necessarily true, and the consumers learn a lot about the market from what the market presents to them. And so the positioning, for example, can affect the segmentation, particularly if it's in a kind of high knowledge uncertainty type of market. So that what you do is you create the evolution of the segments that are there by the nature of the product design that you have, and similarly the targeting. The targeting will evolve over time. Once you are targeting a segment, that segment may actually coalesce more, because once you're creating products and services, individuals who might weakly identify in that segment might actually be pulled more towards that, because there's a gravity effect of plonking products down. The segments themselves may actually be identified around the products once the products are there. So all of this has an interrelationship to it. So in some sense, you have to start somewhere, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the evolution of where you end up is in any way, shape, or form going to be clear. And in many regards, particularly in markets where the segmentation is very diffuse, it isn't very easy to do that. You can sometimes create kind of identifiable groups by the way in which you do the targeting and positioning, by the way you do your advertising, and get individuals to, let's say, become actively involved. And this also relates, for example, to things like co-production systems, where the ultimate product that the consumer consumes is related to the product you put out there, the service you put out there, and how it is the consumer uses those. And we talked about that a bit, in the sense that, even though the hotel room is the hotel room, how people use the hotel room is highly variable. An iPhone is an iPhone, or a Samsung phone is a Samsung phone, but it doesn't mean the individuals are going to utilize it in the same way. And this is kind of very common in platform types of structures. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about this, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can think about how the product engages in kind of local adaptation by looking at the graph on the left, and that is that there's some kind of core to the product, or there might be some sort of kind of generic component to the product, and this expands out. And this is one example here where you've got a kind of product platform, then you've got kind of the packaging components, and then you got the support components. But you can think about this in lots of other different ways. So motorcycle manufacturers, companies like Harley Davidson, they actually sell effectively a very core product, and then the product itself becomes customized by the dealer. And in many cases, that customization is a very substantial portion of the ultimate price and value the customer gets from the product, and also the dealer gets from the product. So essentially, what you have is you have, in that situation, you have an individual who purchases the product. There's a core product there, which is a motorcycle. And there's then a tailoring that goes on with respect to this. And this might allow you to sell things in different markets. In other words, where you could sell a very basic product in a market where the willingness to pay, the ability to pay for a kind of more augmented product isn't there. And people would just simply buy the base product. Okay. But that isn't going to satisfy, let's say, another component of your global market where they might be willing to pay, and there might be other things associated with the product. And therefore, what you do is you basically allow that product to be augmented. Now, you can go the opposite way too. Okay. And an example of this was related to a lot of electronic products. So if you go back in time, you would have an audio system, and the audio system would have a receiver. And that receiver, for example, could have lots and lots and lots of bells and whistles. And you could, let's say, buy a Panasonic or Sony audio receiver, and you could buy one for £399 or £1,500. And the question, of course, is, well, what's the difference? And in many cases, the difference between the products that were offered was that Sony built the high-end product and then turned off a lot of the features. So the front plate that you saw actually turned off features. And this is kind of curious, and sort of say, well, why would they do this? And the answer is it was cheaper to manufacture, let's say, one or two basic designs and then dumb them down than it was to create 20 bespoke, 20 designs, each of which was tailored to 20 different groups. Okay, so literally, if you could take off the front plate of the receiver and you knew how to do the electronic components, you actually could turn components back on. And this was quite common because it was driven by the economics of the production. In other words, rather than building, let's say, 20 different products, each of which sold maybe on average 15,000 or 20,000 units, so you end up with a 1.5 million units. You produce two or three at 500,000 or 350,000 or whatever number it was that you did. And then you kind of took features away. And what this means is it means that this global integration, local responsiveness aspect is this attempt on the part of the company to get those economies of scale, which come from this type of logic, and then do a degree of tailoring where there's clearly some cost of tailoring, but you're able to tailor more because you have more economies of scale from the way you structure the production and the design. And again, what's in these additional bits, what's out here, can be highly variable. In other words, the ability to augment and more and more and more and more and more allows you to kind of go towards more unique segments. Right? So if you could do it infinitely, you have a core product and you have 7 billion alternatives that that exist from this. Now there's a limit to that, but that's basically part of the logic, which means that what you can do is if you can break this up in this way, it allows you to effectively sell across many different markets because you also learn what the minimum price points are that you can charge for those components, and then tailor it in certain sorts of ways. And if you do the value structure in the right way, you don't have an issue of gray market sales, of sales across markets, because in certain markets they actually prefer, in certain segments they are willing to pay for that additional value that they get. And this kind of comes back to the value and use issue. And that is, how do we sort of kind of define value and use? And this is one thing I think you really need to pay a bit of attention to. And that is, there's a simple way to think about the model. And that is that the customer gets value from a product that is made up of a mix of the underlying attributes of the product, right? And so each attribute has a value. I mean, we can get into more complicated models, but just leave it very simple for now. So if a product is made up of n attributes, for any given individual, you simply look at the weighted value of the attributes. Okay. And if you sum all of this up, then you can estimate what's called the willingness to pay. In other words, it effectively becomes the consumer surplus in an economic model, but this allows you to decompose this. And another way to think about it, go back to the prior example, is as I look at each of these components, as I look at the things that might be here, break them up more and more and more and more, I can learn what that number is. Right? And I'll show you an example later on where the estimate of that number actually can tell you sort of kind of where the differences in the value are. And essentially what I can do is I can segment my markets based upon not just the overall willingness to pay, but the willingness to pay for certain components. Now I can redesign the products around that. Okay. So if you think about the consumer as having a cost of acquisition, so that the price of the product plus the cost of acquiring the product, you can think about the customer as having an adaptation cost and value. In this case, we talk about the net value. So it's the benefit that I get from doing the adaptation less the cost, right? Because these are outside what the firm's selling, but you can do exactly the same exercise here for this adaptation if you wanted to. And then the net value in use becomes the value of the attributes of the product you sell minus the price and the cost of acquiring the product, and then the value that they get from the adaptation. And this is the value in use of the consumer. Right? And then the question, of course, is how much of this do you capture? Right? If there's a high cost of acquiring the product, then the value in use goes down. Right? So if you use Brexit as an example of this, and that is if I'm purchasing products from outside the UK now, and before they were relatively free to access, so the cost was just minor shipping, or if on Amazon Prime, no shipping costs. All of a sudden, what I do is I add on these costs. Well, what does that do? Well, it means that the net value the customer gets is lower. But if the price was actually very close to the value of those attributes, then effectively it means that I can't, the price has to go down. So if what ends up happening, of course, is that there's an effect where the cost of acquiring goes up and the price goes up, there will be many consumers for which this value is negative. And if this value here isn't sufficiently positive, then the consumers exit the market. So you have this kind of interesting dynamic here, which sort of says, okay, I'm looking at this kind of net value relative to price, the cost of acquisition, and then the value the customer gets from how they adapt the product themselves, their co-production sort of in this. Then it becomes a kind of interesting equation where you could do lots of things with it. Now, in addition to sort of kind of thinking about this, you can then talk about how you do the segmentation. And normally you don't see it kind of reflected this way, but this is kind of a more of an economics argument. And it is, do I engage in what is known as pooling or separating equilibria? Okay. And then if you think about the logic of pooling, this is kind of a lot of what Ted Levitt talks about. And that is, what I do is I take the customers I pull them together to sell them effectively what amounts to a singular product. So this example here by Henry Ford, customer can have a car painted any color he wants as long as it's black. Okay, effectively treats all the users as the same, and hence the demand is the same thing. So and it may be that the producer knows that all customers aren't the same, but effectively it doesn't have any way of distinguishing amongst those customers. Okay, and that's really kind of the the logic of this. And the production cost, if the cost of producing variants of a product are high, then pooling makes a lot of sense. Because you simply can't engage in tailoring. So one way to think about this is, for example, if you potentially could offer lots and lots and lots of different banking services, so that what you do is you give each individual a different interest rate on their loan, or a different interest rate on their savings accounts or their investments. But suppose you can't identify the differences in people's propensity to switch if the interest rates are different. And what that leaves you with is it leaves you with no alternative but to pool individuals together, effectively have a singular product and not worry about it. And if you think just a bit again, that the within every segment you actually do have pooling. I mean, in the sense that you're assuming that when an individual is in a segment, they're like all in the other individuals in the segment as well. But you can have another argument, and this is the separating equilibrium argument, and that is that users are different and demand different things. And separation can be natural in that individuals or companies reveal their differences through their choice, a posteriori, which means that after the fact you're just letting them make the choice. Now, a way to think about this is suppose what I do is I offer you a different insurance, and the insurance service says, okay, you pay £100 a month for the insurance, and your co-payment is you've got to pay the first £500 of your medical expenses and 10% of all medical expenses above £500. Now I offer you, but I say, but there's no other alternative. The other alternative is cost you £150 a month or £110 a month. Your minimum is £250, and you pay 20% of the visits above 500, the cost of your expenses above 500. Okay, and you look at this and you sort of say, okay, well, the monthly fee is higher on one, lower on one than the other, but the minimum is higher and the copayment is higher. Right. So I'm looking at this and sort of saying, okay, well, do I pay less upfront and then bear part of the risk myself, or do I pay more upfront and have them bear more of the risk? And some people will choose the first one, and some people will choose the second one. And this is a separating equilibrium, and these work really well when you have multiple pricing structures in these systems, because one group of customers will choose the first one and one group of customers will choose the second one, and you don't have any problem here. All you have to do is design it so that the people you want to choose one contract, and the people you want to choose another contract, choose another contract. Insurance companies do this all the time. Banks do this all the time. And any system where, for example, they provide you with monthly payments versus annual payments, those will naturally, different people will make different choices. And then the question, of course, is, well, who are the people making the different choices, and why are they making the different choices? So you can have the products and services existing in the market. There are just many alternatives out there. Okay. And what you're doing is you're segmenting on preferences. Right. So the attribute pricing, things like location, there are all sorts of ways in which you can do this. So for example, if you look at, say, something like takeaway food, you can use Uber Eats, or you can go pick it up yourself. Right? Um, and you would, of course, expect that individuals would make different choices based upon that, and you would expect the pricing to be reflective of what those differences are. And then you have force separation, and force separation is that if you put several products out into the market, everybody would choose one. So effectively, in the separating case, you put out two different products. Some people choose A, some people choose B. In the force case, if you put two products out, call them C and D, everybody would take C and D wouldn't operate. Okay, and there are few exceptions to this, but basically in this situation, if everybody is going to choose C and D, but you want some people to choose D, right? Then you have to find some means by which you more or less force people into a set of circumstances in which only C is available, and force people into sets of circumstances in which only D is available. Okay, and this can be done in a number of different ways. So if you thought about different distribution outlets, right? So that certain products are available only in one distribution outlet, and certain products are only available in another distribution outlet. Okay, and you structure it in a way that these two products don't compete against one another. Right? And in this sense, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a barrier between the two. You're making it costly, and for example, travel time might be a good example of this. Um, or pre-registration or pre-selection might be another way of being able to generate this type of things. And normally in this case, what you're doing is you're relying much more on a priori type of segmentation. In other words, in the first case of a separating segmentation case, you don't know which individual really is going to make that choice, but you don't care. You've structured the product so that you know that some percent are going to choose this and some percent are going to choose that. In the second set of circumstances, everybody would choose one if you gave them the alternative, and so you've got to structure the whole system so that it's more costly for somebody to switch between the products that you're providing in that marketplace. So the force one is typically what's known as a priori, and I'll come back to the difference here. Okay, so in this situation, the products can't really coexist in the same market. So you might sell a different product in China than you sell in Hong Kong, or you sell a different product in the UK than you do in France. And whereas in the separating case, you could put all the products out in the UK and all the products out in France. You wouldn't care. You just let people choose. So this situation here is in some ways is a little bit more of what we see, but the smarter one is actually the separating one if you can get away with it. Now, the other aspect of this is you can think about how you want to structure this. So thinking about the segmentation could be within country, right? Or it can be across country. So you could have a diverse and diffuse segmentation structure, right? In the sense that different places are really different segments in and of themselves. Or you can have universal ones, which means that you're looking across countries. So I might be looking at young millennials, but it doesn't matter where those young millennials are. Okay. Or I might be looking at K-pop fans, but I don't care where those K-pop fans are. Right. As opposed to sort of saying, well, no, what I'm interested in Asian young millennials, and then even narrower Korean young millennials. Then you can look at the target and sort of say, well, how could the target be structured? Well, the targeting can be structured, kind of at a country level or even regional level. You can go below that if you want to, and or global. Right? So here go country, region, global, but it could be sub-country region. So it could be the northeast of England. So it could be Yorkshire versus Lancashire. So you can go beyond this, but it could be, for example, European, or it could be global. So you can see, I could say, well, I've really got a universal segmentation structure. Okay. But the way I'm targeting that is I'm targeting at the country level. So I'm looking at a universal segmentation structure where I think all young millennials are basically the same. But the way I'm going to do the targeting is I'm going to do the targeting at country level. Okay. As opposed to I'm looking at young millennials, but I'm going to treat them in terms of a global group, right? And this would affect, for example, when we get down to the product aspect of this would affect, for example, the advertising. How do I position the product? What brand name do I use? And so on that line. What proposition do I make as in terms of the nature of the lifestyle values? Right. So when you get to the product, right, the product could be a global product. Take Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola might have a targeting which is global regional. You can see this when you do the case, but the product itself may be universal. Right? So the product itself can be tailored, and by the product I'm talking about the product in terms of image and everything else. So when you look at the segmentation, targeting, and positioning, the product's kind of capturing the positioning aspect of this. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, I can mix and match this. Right? I can have a universal segmentation perspective, which I then, from an operational standpoint, focus the targeting not on that universal segment, but that segment in certain countries. And I could do that with some degree of modification, let's say. And that modification may be that the product is core, but the advertising might be quite unique. Okay. So if HSBC does a kind of a bit of this, right? And that is that they do have a universal, mostly universal, but probably more regional segmentation approach. Their targeting is actually more country based, but the product is actually universal in the sense that they offer the same basic product structure in almost all places. There'd be little modification, but they're closer over here. But their targeting is actually more at a country based. So what you'll see they have the same kind of basic structure in terms of their segmentation, who they want, why they want them, in what age categories, and so on online. But their targeting is at the country level. Their advertising is actually at the country level, even though they use this, the world's local bank model. The advertising actually is very, very, very localized, and the marketing budget is actually at that level. And then the product offerings are effectively fairly similar across the board. So when you're looking at it, you can kind of look at this and sort of say, okay, well, how am I thinking about this? How's my segmentation sort of kind of structured geographically, right? How is my product structured? Again, looking at this kind of geographically, and how's my targeting geographically? And what that allows you to do is that allows you to take kind of the standard segmentation, targeting, positioning, and move it over to global context. So if you look at the segmentation, that customer needs and wants are heterogeneous, and this is the thing I will continue to keep pushing and pushing, because if you don't have this country heterogeneity, segmentation doesn't make sense. And if you don't have this country, this heterogeneity operating in some way distributionally across the globe, potentially in different ways, then you don't really have a need to think about marketing in a rather complex way. Right? Now, if you move from the B2C case to the B2B case, you probably do find that there is less heterogeneity there. And part of the reason is a lot of B2B demand is simply based upon the economics of the structure of production. And therefore, the B2B demand for container shipping or um, uh, personal protective equipment, a lot of that will simply be driven by the underlying economics of this. There might be a difference in the willingness to pay, in the sense that, for example, for PPE, a poor country might not be able to pay as much as a wealthy country might be able to pay. But that isn't material in the sense that the economics of the demand are very clear, and that is PPE to one doctor is the same as PPE to another doctor, more or less. So there isn't this need to kind of make unique design differences to the product. From an individual product service consumption perspective, there are groups of customers out there who have similar needs, right? And it may be that they have similar needs but different purchasing habits, right? It may be that they have what appear to be similar needs, but when you look at their underlying preferences, those preferences might be slightly different. And therefore you have this, okay, there's heterogeneity out there, that's great. But what I want the Goldilocks model, which says, yeah, there's heterogeneity out there, but it's neither too much or too little. If it's too much, then I can't accommodate it because it's just too much. Right? If there's too little, then it doesn't pay for me to accommodate it. So I want this sweet spot. I want this sweet spot where I've got a bit of these. And in some sense, global companies might be able to win a little bit more in this because if, suppose what I do is I look in one country, I look at my home country and sort of say, well, there isn't a lot of heterogeneity here for my product. Okay. But there is heterogeneity between what I'm producing, the demand for my product in my country versus another country. Right? So it's simply heterogeneity based upon country. Or it could be that there are several segments in my country. Okay. And the big problem I've got is none of them are economically really viable. But if I look in another country, exactly those same segments exist. And they also may not be economically viable in that country. But if I pull the two of them together and sell to those segments across countries, the combined size of those segments is economically valuable. Okay, so there are all sorts of kind of mixing and matching ways you can think about this. Okay, so if you think about the segmentation, what you're doing is you're taking customers and you're dividing them into smaller groups based upon similar needs, wants, uses, and preferences. And the ideal set of circumstances is to have homogeneous segments, but heterogeneity between segments. Okay, now you don't end up with that in reality, but the idea would be that there's one segment over here, everybody in that segment is very clear. There's another segment over here, everybody within that's clear. But the reality is, of course, is you get this diffusion where there might be more of a heavy concentration over here, more in a heavy concentration over here, and there's some spillover in between. And there's a very simple model that this guy David Ginch put together probably back in the 1970s, might even be before this. It actually put it together for GE, and it was very simple. And it was said, you can think about customers in four ways. There are customers who are loyal to me and won't switch away from my product to your product. Right? There are customers of yours who will not switch away from your product to my product. And then there are customers who are loyal to you to some degree, but will switch. And there are customers who are loyal to me and we'll switch. And the strategy becomes very clear. In other words, I don't beat my brains out about the extremes because they're not going to switch. What I do is I fight to protect the customers I have who will switch to you, and I target the customers that you have, which will switch to me. Okay. Now, there is a big game theoretic issue associated with that, but it does show the logic essentially that there will be some people who will be heavily embedded in the segment, and there will be some people for whom they're not really heavily embedded in that segment. And that, that creates, leakage. Ideally, what you'd like to have is you'd like to have, just these two extremes and don't worry about it, but you're not going to have those two extremes. Okay. So segments typically, well, you want segments that are more homogeneous inside the segment and then have bigger differences across the segments. And the other aspect of this, of course, is that once you make it more messy, that you have this lack of absolutism in terms of who's in what segment. So sometimes you'll see and I'll show you some examples of this where market research companies will categorize individuals as kind of eco warriors, eco moms, anti-environmentalist, fascist, whatever. Right? They'll have these specific categories, right? But those categories aren't really separable. They're actually probabilistic. And which means that individuals will actually appear to be in multiple segments. So use my example of culture again, where you might sort of say, well, individuals are made up of many cultures. Okay. And the answer, of course, is yeah. How do you actually characterize those individuals as being, from a standpoint of these cultural mixtures? And I showed you an example where you basically treat them as probabilistic. And this is the way most all marketing now looks on it. And that is that individuals could be parts of all sorts of different mixtures of segments. You view them as probabilistic. Now, some people will be in one segment with 100% probability, but that's not true of everybody. And in fact, it's probably not true of most people. And the degree to which there's spillover, then individuals' probabilities will converge more towards random. So if there's 5 segments and you have a 20% probability being in each of the segments, that's random. Okay. And that doesn't really help the firm very much in terms of being able to target specific individuals. It's going to want to have 80-20. There are 5 segments, you're in 2 of them. One you're in 80% of the time, the other one you're in 20% of the time. And this is kind of partially why the separation works better. Because if, for example, let's say you were in 2 segments and you were in one of those segments 80% of the time, the other one 20% of the time, there are a couple things I would know. That is, if I want to satisfy you, I concentrate on products for those 2 segments, not the other 3. But also I know that 80% of the time you're going to choose one and 20% of the time you're going to choose the other. And therefore what I'll do is I'll put my product mix out there in a way, does it say, accommodate that. Now, an even better set of circumstances is there's another person out there for which the opposite is true, right? They're 80% than 20%. Okay. And I can put both products out, and in a given day, somebody's going to choose one, somebody's going to choose another. I don't care who it is. Okay. But I do know that there's a difference amongst the 2 of them. And I might actually position the advertising slightly differently if I can do this in a meaningful way. Okay. So that's actually more sophisticated. Most of what you see in companies isn't quite so sophisticated. Most of them use what are known as a priori approaches. And these a priori approaches basically look at things like the demographics and geography and all sorts of things about the individual, or they look at things like attitudinal segmentation. They look at surveys of what people value and so on down the line. They try to kind of put people into clusters. So my example with the eco warrior. So if you look at a lot of these segments, what will happen is people will say, okay, how much do you care about the environment? How much, recycling do you do? And they ask all sorts of questions. They do a cluster analysis, and from that cluster analysis, they put names and labels on the different groups. Or what they do is they do it based upon geography. They look, for example, at individuals' disposable wealth in any given period. And then they cluster people, let's say, in wealth categories or in lifestyle categories. Do they have children? How many children do they have? On down the line. And a lot of this, is simply based upon either things like survey data, which is somewhat suspect, or other types of data. So many years ago, I worked with Nissan on their global platform design for automobiles. And one of the things that they did is they looked at the simple demographic and lifestyle aspects across the world. Who's in which age category? When do families have children? How many children do they have? Do they live in an environment in which things are concentrated or diffuse, which means they need different types of vehicles? And they decided on not only their global platform, for example, minivans versus small cars versus SUVs versus all this other stuff, but also where they would distribute them across the world. And therefore they could alter the product mixture based upon the platforms. So, for example, a minivan and a sedan might actually use the same platform. They would simply alter this based upon their prediction. So next year's model or the models out for the next couple of years would be based upon these demographic trends. And there would be different segments of different people in different lifestyle categories. And then there are a posteriori approaches, and these are really the true separating one. So the first one, the a priori ones, are mostly for segmentation. The a posteriori ones are natural segmentation. And essentially what you do here is you look at things like loyalty, you look at usage, other types of things which are signaling kind of realistic data. Individuals where you're looking at, let's say, the way people consume things. So a lot of companies today will look at the mobile phone data. They'll look at the mobile phone data, your location data, and they'll look at your Facebook friends, and they'll actually know when you're together with certain people. So by matching up, when you're together, they could actually be micro targeting what it is that you're doing. Some stores, particularly in places like the United States, do this within the store. So the Wi-Fi networks that you have in the store actually show people's movements around the store. And this is also the other thing which allows groups like Amazon and others to have checkoutless operations. So essentially, you can know what people were doing. You can know whether they're stopping in front of one area of the store versus stopping in front of another area of the store. And you can structure demand profiles based on that. Once you structure demand profiles, then you can start doing segmentation. And then there's needs-based segmentation, which is more related to that model I gave you before, which is, okay, how do these attitudes and preferences differ? And this is really good when you're looking at things where there's a difference between, let's say, what you might want to try to get out of a survey. In other words, what are people's values? Well, that's notoriously dodgy. So if you ask people, do they care about certain types of things? People typically either don't know or they care about everything. So you get really pretty bad data. But with preference data, if you do it in the right ways, for experimentally, if you go out, you experiment on people, or you use their purchase data to estimate preference attributes, value, those W's in that equation, you can then really start segmenting on that. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. the other aspect of this, which makes these a posteriori approaches a little bit more unique and also, not as universal, is that they require more analytic sophistication. So the big market research companies, the big data companies, the people who do the analysis of your Nectar card data, or your online purchases, the Amazons of the world, they use a lot more of this second approach because they have enormous amounts of data on you, and the more sophisticated statistical approaches are really the way they go, and it provides really precise data, scarily precise data. So you can see some of these examples here. This is the geographic demographic segmentation is used by Experian. So these are people who do credit ratings and other things like that, but they have all sorts of other data, and they have all of these different types of structures. It's something called mosaic. And so what they're doing is they're looking at the segmentation of who they are, what they do, what they purchase, and the targeting is where they are. So if you look at this, of course, this is how they break up the segmentation. I've given the example here from Australia because it's the only data I have available to me. But they have this for many countries. They have it for the UK, have for the United States, Canada, many other places. And essentially what it does is it allows you to do, companies come and they sort of say, okay, well, we want to know where to put a store. And therefore, we're trying to target certain specific types of individuals. And this is a priori. I mean, it's based upon the existing data that's there. It's not really looking at anything more sophisticated than that. Another example of this is Nielsen's Prism, and again, this one's from America, but effectively, what they're doing here again is a priori. What they're doing is they're looking at how individuals are in different categories. Again, it would work for things like little ones that come in, they want to know where they're going to put a store. Aldi comes in, they want to know where they put a store. And they're going to think about who's really the case here, right? So the segmentation parameters are life stage and social, okay, and then there's the targeting parameters, which are these things down here, okay. So the difference, a bit of the difference between the mosaic one and this one here, is that Nielsen is actually throwing in some behavioral data. So they're looking at the what other things people might have bought. Okay, so they're mixing this up a little bit. So this is a little bit a priori, but potentially a little bit a posteriori. So it's a little bit more of a mixture of the two. Okay, this is the values segmentation approach, something called VALS. And again, this is breaking people in based upon values. Okay, and again, if you think here, what do you got here? You got a whole bunch of kind of standard demographic type of data, some ownership, okay, and then if you look at this last one as an example, was there's some survey based information here, but again, this is mostly a priori, okay, not a posteriori. Okay, so you might sort of say, well, could I create a values model based upon posteriori kind of things? And the answer is I could. And the way I could do it is I could instead of surveying these people to create these segments, what I could do is, yeah, I could ask them, is prayer part of my daily life? But I could put them in experiments, or I could look at other sets of circumstances. For example, if there's a conflict between, let's say, going to church or praying or not praying or doing something, what would they choose? Right? And I have some examples where, of things where we've done situations like this, where we put people in these conflicting situations, and then related back to, okay, well, who are these people? And if you do it that way, you're getting better data, uh, better information on these things. Again, it's still a mixture of the a priori types of things. And if you look at the limits of this, particularly if it's attitudinal information, you're really relying on mostly subjective differences amongst individuals. So you tend to kind of focus a lot on the demographics, where people live, how much money they make, and so on and on. Okay. When you get into the attitudinal ones, you really create some problems for yourself, because you have real problems, like I talked about in the supplement to the culture lecture, that when you're asking people things for which there might be a social bias, individuals will potentially not tell you the truth. But it may also be that individuals might not know, because it's not contextualized, and therefore, if it's not contextualized, it might not be all that good. Okay. The other aspect of this is attitudinal segments tend to be less stable. Again, this is the contextualization aspect of this, and you can affect those. So you can affect emotion, you can affect the nature of how people feel or what they think by their social networks. You can even affect aspects of behavior by their social networks. There are many studies which have looked at things like obesity and smoking and drinking and so on online. And one of the simplest ways, for example, to stop people from smoking is to put them in social networks in which nobody else smokes. If you want to get people to start smoking, put them in social networks where a fair number of people smoke. And that's very common. So if you really are going to do attitudinal types of segmentation, you really have to do very sophisticated types of things. Okay, and I want to get into sort of kind of how it is that you do this, but it is a lot harder, but it's a lot more meaningful. Now, if you look at it from the international standpoint, it's generally easier to do country by country segmentation on a priori types of things, and it's it's simply because it's much simpler to look for the similarities for which there were boundaries, and those boundaries sometimes do have meaning, in the sense that if the boundaries are also driven by tariffs or trade barriers or ports or a whole host of other things like language, then potentially it does, it makes some sense. Okay. And you do have this other problem, which I discussed before, that people use these measurement scales in very different ways. They don't think about things in exactly the same way. And if the way in which you're doing things is going to be driven by information coming in this way, the quality of that information has to be comparable on an international basis. Survey data, generally speaking, is pretty dicey on an international basis. So you have to be very careful how it is that you do it. Now, one way to solve this is not to use multiple item scales, is to use either what are known as discrete choice scales. People say yes or no to something, or you use extreme values where you put up two things and you say A or B. Again, it's discrete choice, but the main point of that is that it reduces some of the scale biases and gets you a bit more clarity in terms of what it is you're doing. And the other is you've got to be very careful because these types of approaches are mainly based upon ex post justification. In other words, they take the data, they hammer away at the data, They see a bunch of different patterns, and they justify those patterns ex post. So the names you saw attached to these different types of segments are ex post rationalizations of what's there. They're not ex ante predictions of what will be there. They're just simply made up names. And when you get that in an international context, that may be really quite dicey in terms of sort of kind of trying to come up with some sort of descriptors which tells you what it is these segments are really all about. Now, the approach that most people have moved to, or at least kind of certainly all the academics have moved to this, but is really what's known as behavioral segmentation. A lot of big data is really moved on the behavioral segmentation because if it isn't just demographics, but you have purchasing data of individuals over a long period of time, then you can do very, very good behavioral segmentation. So it focuses on a lot of the data on what is known as revealed preference. So a survey is kind of a stated preference. I state something, but it's not necessarily what I do. Whereas the behavioral segmentation models rely much more on revealed data. How does that individual behave in the context in which you're doing things? And if you can track that in real time, if you have millions and millions of data points, it becomes a lot easier to do. And so you can do lots of things with this. Okay, so you can do a lot of different types of models. You can embed it within experiments. All the A/B experimentation work that people talk about with respect to Google and others, that is actually all based upon behavioral segmentation models. So let me give an example of this. You can think about usage segmentation. So customers are looking at usage data. So you can think about things like heavy users versus light users. You can think about time and place of use, right? And inside the home, outside the home, with the network, outside the network. All these sorts of things become there. This is why Google makes so much money. And also why they protect the fact that they want to be able to use this data, even if the data itself is anonymized. If it can be linked, it still has they can still meet a lot of the demands that they have for how they think about the nature of the data. So you can think about a lot of ways of doing this. I once did a study in the Netherlands where we basically had the entire country, other than children, because we had all the major grocery chains. And because we had that data, we could do a lot. And you could learn a lot when you're doing it. All of it was anonymized. We didn't know who the people were, but we knew who they were from the sense that we knew that person shopped for this stuff on Tuesday and this stuff on Wednesday and this stuff on Thursday. We just didn't know who that person was. And we were restricted in terms of getting things like their addresses, so we couldn't even go back that. But even within those limitations, you can do enormous amount of stuff. And this relies on databases. And as crude as they may be, the amount of data is just absurd. And generally speaking, when you look at this, because you've got all of this data, you get overwhelmed by it. And so you have kind of this odd set of circumstances where, with a lot of the a priori segmentation, you actually have very crude data. And really not necessarily all the data that you want. In the case of the behavioral segmentation, you're in circumstances where sometimes you have enormous amounts of data, but you can't use all that data. And therefore, what you tend to do is you tend to step back and focus on subset segments of the customers. You want to learn more about your profitable customers than you do necessarily about the customers you're not really going to care about all that much. So you can think about an example of this, and this is the case of last purchase occasion versus current purchase occasion, and it goes back to that example I gave about loyal versus switching, and you can sort of kind of look at this and sort of say, okay, well, I can look at this information here, and I can see amongst the reds, which are on the diagonal, these are the loyal from one purchase occasion to another purchase occasion. So if they purchased it last week, they purchased it this week, they purchased it yesterday, they purchased it today. And then you can sort of say, okay, well, where are the switchers here? How big is this group, right? Because if you think about it this way, approximately 60% of the market ain't going anywhere, right? And then the question becomes, well, all right, well, if 80% of the market or 60% of the market isn't going anywhere, all right, then what do I pay attention to? And in the case here, you look at it and say, okay, well, if I'm Coke and Pepsi, then I worry about each other here, right? So Coke worries about switching over to Pepsi. What's Diet Coke worry about? They worry about Diet Pepsi, right? But they also worry about a big cannibalization. But they don't care about this so much, right? It's because it's within their product. They care about that, right? So if you looked at these two here, you sort of say, okay, well, what's the difference between somebody drinking Coke and somebody drinking Diet Coke? The answer is that somebody drinking Coke is going to switch more to Pepsi, relatively speaking, right? So whereas here, it's only going to be 15% that goes out of the company. In the Pepsi case, again, it's the switching is going this way, right? They don't have to be the same, by the way. And it's only that. So you can see Coke and Pepsi head to head. Right? Think about Diet Pepsi. No, Diet Pepsi has, again, 11% internal. It's very similar to that one, and 14% here, which is Diet Coke. Right? So Diet Coke worries about Diet Pepsi worries about Diet Coke, right? And so you can immediately see what's the thing driving the at least this group right now. It's kind of sugar, non-sugar, okay, and it's Pepsi Coke. Don't worry about Sprite. Sprite is kind of off on the side. But what does Sprite worry about? Well, Sprite look at this and sort of say, well, what do I worry about? Well, I worry about Coke and Pepsi. Again, it's still the sugar bit, I guess. But the main point again here is I have much higher concerns here across these categories. Whereas, Coke worries about Pepsi, doesn't really worry about Sprite. Pepsi worries about Coke, doesn't worry about Sprite. Sprite worries about Coke and Pepsi. And again, on the diet side, it's exactly the same. Right. So you could keep looking at this in lots and lots of ways. You can think about it across larger numbers of categories and more sophisticated categories. But this is the kind of data that would be available to you. Okay, so and it's really driven by sugar content. And you can think about needs-based segmentation. Now, this is more complicated, right? And the focus here is essentially on the fundamental drivers, and that is, what is it that people are trying to satisfy? I'm not worried about just what they purchase. I'm a little bit worried about kind of what's the operative mechanism that's looking at this. Okay, so it might be things like functional performance, and generally speaking, if you go back to that attribute model, this is the kind of thing that we're really talking about. We're talking about, okay, what is it that makes up the product, and what is it that individuals are doing? And it, some of this could be image. It could be, things which are broadly speaking beyond kind of pure function. But again, it's really looking at this as sort of saying, okay, well, what is it that the consumer wants from that product in terms of the nature of the makeup of that product? So you want to understand the customer preferences here. Again, you can do this in B2B cases as well. It's actually easier in B2B cases. And simply because you don't have as many of the kind of soft attributes, which might be things like image or stuff like that. And there are multiple ways they can do it, right? You can do it. You can use um, Likert scales and conjoint type of methods. Essentially, you can look at trade-off types of things. You can do experiments. We've done a lot of them where they're literally visualizations. So you have an individual kind of in a 3D shopping setting, and you can look at you can change the things on the screens and all sorts of really neat ways you can do this these days. Needs-based segmentation still does suffer from weaknesses on attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so the question becomes the sophistication of how it is that you're doing and trying to sort of kind of do it. And let me give you an example of this. And this is actually using the more sophisticated approach, which is Bayesian segmentation, behavioral Bayesian-based econometric models of conjoint data. The difference here is if you do a regression, for example, you can think about doing a regression and you get an equation. Okay, think of it if you had 1,400 consumers, and rather than getting one equation or two, you get 1,400 equations. So for every person, you get an equation, and you segment people based upon the similarity of the equations. Okay? Now, and it sounds actually simple, and in some ways it is, at least conceptually. So what you're doing is you're saying how similar are these people in terms of the model they use to value a product. And in this case here, we're talking about ethical attributes. So this is an example with athletic shoes. This is real data, by the way. So it's hundreds of people. And here you have a breakdown that sort of says, okay, bunch of attributes are the brands, right? A bunch of attributes are social, in the sense was child labor used to produce this type of thing. Well, it wasn't quite that brutal, but basically individuals who were under the age of 16 worked in production, whether minimum wages were paid or local wages that potentially were below minimum wages, et cetera, et cetera. Where was it produced? And then a whole series of functional attributes: shock absorption, weight of the shoe, on down the line, and then price. Right? And these weights here, okay, so this price here is the price elasticity. Right? So you have a price elasticity. You could look at the brand part and sort of say, okay, that's a brand loyalty measure. Right? And then the rest of these are estimates of those W's in that equation I gave you before. Okay, and the stars tell you whether it's significant or not. So if you look at this and you say, okay, let's look at all these equations, take 1,400 equations, and you say, okay, how do they relate? Okay, and what we can show is okay, there basically are three groups. And for any one individual, you have a probability of being in group one, a probability of being in group two, and a probability of being in group three. Right? So, there might be a few people who are 100% in group one, and there might be some people 100% in group two, and some other people 100% in group three. Okay, but the reality is that most people are what is known as a mixture. Right? But these are kind of characteristics of those general groups. So if you're in segment one, you basically, if you look at it, you're very, very, very price sensitive. You care about fit, you care about reflectivity, you care about fabric, you care about, you don't care about any of these things here, you care about price. You care to some degree whether it's a domestic product or not. You don't care about You care about these things a little bit. The negative means that if the conditions are dangerous, then you're less likely to purchase it. This says, for example, if it's heavier, you're less likely to purchase it. Okay. And you care a little bit about brands. Here, in the case of Adidas, Reebok, you actually don't like. And then you have brand segment. And if you look at the brand segment, these are people who focus on the brands. Right? So they care about Nike and Adidas. Right? Care a little bit about child labor, care a little bit about functional entry, but you notice the price elasticity is very low. Right? So these were this first group was very price sensitive. This one is actually price inelastic. They care about brand. And there's the ethical group, okay, which cares about a mixture of these functional attributes. Notice most of the functional attributes come in, but they also care to some degree about this. So if a minimum wage is paid, they're happier. If child labor is there, again, less, and so on. Okay, and they're more or less anti-brand. Okay, they focus on the others. Okay, so you can look at this and sort of say, oh, okay. Now what I've done is I've sort of kind of broken this up. But one of the things that you'd actually sort of kind of find interesting is this functionality social attribute relationship. In other words, just because these people care about the social attributes doesn't mean they don't care about the functional attributes. And in fact, if you compare it across these, you'd actually see that the ethical group people are more concerned about functionality too. Whereas these other ones, these people give up functionality for price. These people actually give up some aspects of functionality for brand. So it's not as simple as it looks. So it gives you a more sophisticated way of thinking about it. But here's the interesting aspect of this: is you can look across countries. So you look at this and sort of say, okay, here are the decision models of the consumers. Here's their choice models. How does this vary based upon where they're located? So this is looking at, okay, what's the likelihood that an individual is in each of these segments? Remember, I told you that there was probability. Each individual has a probability of being in segment 1, probability of being segment 2, probability of being segment 3. You take that information and you ask the question, well, how does that vary across countries? And you actually do see some country differences. Okay, it turns out that it's not related to income or age or anything like that. The Koreans are much more likely to be in the price segment. The Turks are not. To some degree, the Germans aren't, but the Spanish and Americans, no, it doesn't matter. In the brand segment, the Spanish are less likely to be in the brand segment, right? The Turks more, right? USA less, and so on. But if you look at the dark ones, you can sort of say, okay, well, suppose that I could only have one strategy in each country. Well, then it becomes clear. I would emphasize the ethics more in the Spanish and German case. I would emphasize the brand more in the Turkish case, and I would emphasize price more in the Korean case, and a bit of the ethics in the U.S. case as well. Okay, so but that would only be if I only had one strategy, right? But I can offer all three strategies, right? Because there's nothing stopping me from potentially putting products out there which satisfied all three groups, right? And in particular, if I was Nike, if I was Adidas as an example here, okay, I could look at this and sort of say, okay, well, I kind of win in a bit more here from brand loyalty, and I'm really hurt here. Okay? Is there some way I can compensate for that? Yeah, maybe not. But I could also tell you that if I looked at that and said, well, I'm as Adidas, I'm hurt by the ethical segmentation. What it means is I'm more likely to be hurt in Germany, more likely to be hurt in Spain, more likely to be hurt in the United States. Where branding matters a lot, then I could look at this and sort of say, well, okay, branding matters a lot more here. Okay, so I can come up with much more sophisticated way of thinking about it if I wanted to do it that way. Right, it's not necessarily the case that I would necessarily want to do it that way, but I can see that there are these country differences. All right, um, based upon the nature of the models that are there. Okay, but you also have to be very careful about it. And this shows again another aspect of sophistication. And I'm not doing this by country because it's too complicated to do it by country. But again, take the same model which came from the prior one. And in fact, we show, generally speaking, that there's a fairly generalizability associated with this. Um, but I'll give two examples, or example where two products. Again, where the three segments kind of arise out of this. So there's three types of decision models. There's one that's primarily driven more by brand orientation, one driven by price orientation, one driven by social ethical orientation. And you can sort of say, okay, well, how do they flip over, right? How does it go from this one group to this other group? And what you see that if I look just at the shoe case where brand mattered, then and I look at across the battery case, then if you care about brand, if your decision model is skewed towards brand, it turns out that your decision model for batteries isn't skewed to brand, is skewed towards social. If your decision model for the batteries is brand, then there's no predictability as to your decision model on shoes. If your decision model in shoes is oriented towards price, again, there's not a clear indicator of how your decision model would look with respect to batteries. If it was based upon batteries on price, it looks like batteries price on shoes works. And then social against social, nothing. And this is one of the things that I always like to point out about this idea of kind of ethical consumption, that individuals are ethical consumers, right? Well, no, they are actually quite discriminatory. If you are an ethical consumer in case of batteries, or an ethical consumer with respect to shoes, that does not actually have a lot of predictability. It turns out that the overlap of the two ethics to ethics, let's say, or social to social, is only 11%. And that's kind of critical around this heterogeneity idea. And that is that you really have to be quite sophisticated in the way in which you think about these things. And ultimately, though, you come back to the targeting aimed at, okay, well, why? Why am I targeting that group? Okay, and again, there's a multiplicity of these kind of performance measures. I can be doing it simply because I need to get scale, or I need to get growth. I can be doing it for structural reasons, and that is that what I'm doing is I'm protecting existing brands. I am protecting, let's say patents. I'm doing other types of things which are related to the structure. Okay, or I can do it with respect to alignment. In other words, what I want is I want some sort of kind of coherence. I want to have good efficiency, so I'm doing it based upon profit or performance. And I think this is this when you look at this issue for any one product, it isn't going to always be profitability, because of this portfolio issue, and that is that for the segments that are being selected, some will be selected for profitability performance. Some segments will be there for protection purposes. So you actually have companies, for example, like I gave this example before, where I said, well, suppose what you do is you have a segment where everybody would choose product C and nobody would choose product D. And one of the questions will be, well, do you put product D as an alternative? And the answer is, you may actually put a product out there, at least in theory, for which nobody buys it. Okay, and this is very common in let's say jewelry or high fashion items. And that is, what you do is you put out a product that really isn't available to anybody, or maybe available to one person. Okay. And the reason is that what it does is it anchors the market, and it anchors the distribution of things. So that when people see D, C looks good. And in other words, I offer a couture gown at $180,000. Okay, and then I offer a whole series of other things, at a few $100s. And that actually is purposeful. Okay, but the main point of this being that there isn't really a segment there, or there may be a small segment for which you're not going to make any money, but what it does is it affects the other segments, in terms of this. And this is kind of this notion of kind of, is there an irrelevance of unchosen alternatives? If you believe there's an irrelevance of unchosen alternatives, then it doesn't matter. But if you believe that there is a relevance of unchosen alternatives, then the fact that there might be an alternative that you don't choose, but it affects the alternative you do choose, then you might actually put it in there. And you may also have loss leaders and others, where you put products out there, they're going to lose. And this works in environments in particular where the purchasing is purchased as a bundle, like in grocery purchasing. Individuals rarely go into a grocery store with the idea of purchasing one item. And therefore, their decision model isn't actually at the individual product category level as much as the bundle level. And that's a much more complicated model. So as you look across this, you can see that there's a whole host of different things that are at play. And when you put these all out onto the international arena, they get more complicated. Okay, so the bases associated with segmentation arise, and in particular, if you're a company which is starting internationalization, there's no indication that the segmentation pattern that you're going to see in the countries you move into will in any way, shape, or form look like the ones from the country in which you're moving from. All right, and that can create all sorts of difficulties. Okay, so when you look at this, you can think about it as having that additional part. Okay, the segmentation alternatives are more expansive, but that maybe have its cost and its benefits. Generally speaking, I think it has benefits. It means that the segmentation can be redone, re-expanded. But every time you go into new markets, if you're doing a global segmentation model, you got to redo the segmentation model, because as you add countries in or you add markets in, there's no indication that the pattern you're going to see is going to be the same. It's also the issue that it may be that the pattern is the same, but the attractiveness isn't the same. So that what you do is you end up sort of saying, well, do I target the same segments in China as I do in the United States? Okay, or in Germany as I do in France. And then there's also the positioning, right? Which then is kind of all part of this equation. And that sort of says, well, okay, am I really putting the same products and services out there? Am I creating an image, or is the meaning of the brand the same vis-a-vis the competitors? Because in this situation, it may be that the competitors change. And therefore, even though I might look at the segments and sort of say, yeah, this looks like a pretty good segment for me, it's the one I serve in my home market, and therefore I should really focus on this segment or this group of segments. And then I look at the competitors and realize, well, hang on a second, they're all there too. All right, what do I do? I mean, the best of all possible worlds, of course, is that they aren't there. Okay, but if these really are, profitable segments, odds are they're going to be there. So all of that kind of creates a kind of dynamic. Now, this will be a core of what we do, going on through most of the remainder of the course, because ultimately, as many of my more pure marketing friends talk about, marketing is really all about segmentation, targeting, positioning. No matter how it is that you play it, you can almost take everything that you do in marketing and put it into that basket. So with that, I will stop and look forward to the discussion of the lecture on the day. So thank you.